Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. I'm busy running Mother Base, as you can see. I'm from Bag of Knives, my name's Luke, and you've probably seen a lot of reviews of Metal Gear Solid 5, and you've probably played the game yourself, and if you have, you might have some questions or some thoughts about, how it all ends, and does it really work that well? And, we're not too interested in whether it's a good game or a bad game. It's a good game. But we want to look at some different things, do some closer analysis of the themes and the ideas that go on underneath the skin of Metal Gear Solid 5. So we thought we'd do a video on absence and loss in the game, which I feel is a pretty heavy theme throughout the whole thing. And you might not have seen this before, and if you have, that's great, but if not, here you go. A big long video on all these things that I think make Metal Gear Solid 5 work as a really clever game about loss and absence.
It's been a fair while now since I saw the end of Metal Gear Solid 5. The final mission appeared unceremoniously on the iDroid checklist, but it wasn't a surprise. I already knew it existed. I suspected the scenes it contained from glimpses I'd snatched on forums and social media feeds. After the final revelation, that of a smirking imposter smashing a mirror and walking back into the fog of a war without end, there was an absence. Something was missing. A sensation that all prior Metal Gear games had delivered, even up to and including Ground Zeroes. Despite feeling burnt out from playing over the course of a few days, I was left with a lingering feeling of absence and loss. I think that's partly down to the final twist, or perhaps the lack thereof. The frisson of realisation that everything I'd experienced up until that point had been facts permitted to me rather than facts unbound. The Man Who Sold the World. It's a perfect name for a mission that posited to bridge the gap between 5 and Metal Gear. A story of how a man became a demon. Well, it turned out that that narrative bridge didn't exist. Players were left grasping for meaning, as Venom Snake was left grasping in the intro. A one-eyed amputee, lacking depth perception, groggy from a 9-year coma, trying to grab a petal of the Star of Jerusalem with the claw of a prosthetic arm. Prior to release, Kojima spoke about his intent to make the player feel a sense of phantom pain with Metal Gear Solid 5. He wanted to evoke the dissatisfaction of revenge, to make Skullface a villain without a Hollywood ending, a phantom on the periphery of the story that left the player feeling cheated. Hideo's legacy makes it hard to feel like anything in his games isn't deliberate, despite each entry being an exercise in further muddying an already swollen tapestry of retcons and crossed wires. The acrimonious split with Konami and the decidedly rushed feeling of the second chapter of Metal Gear Solid 5 further serve to render all objective declarations on the matter subjective and speculative.
V has come to.
V has come too.
I'm also quite interested in the fact that this entry is called Metal Gear Solid V instead of Metal Gear Solid 5. Now, I'm aware that V is the Roman numeral for 5, and that GTA 5 also did this, but I feel like it has at least a little more significance here. After all, V stands for Venom, for Vic Boss, and for the forked path and dual nature of its hero. The revelation that from one name, one legend, and one individual sprung 2 branches. It's the kind of authorial decision that feels hard not to attribute to Kojima, a motif not unlike those he has filled his previous games with. And it's because of this motif, and a few other things that I'll discuss later on, that I have faith in the overarching message of V. Regardless of the perceived success of its twist, or perhaps the failure, I'm ambivalent. MGS5 is ambitious, both thematically and on a systems level. As the third most expensive Japanese game ever made, it's no surprise that the resultant product didn't quite meet everyone's expectations, but I'm more interested in trying to unpack the idea of how much of it was deliberate, how effective it all was, and I'm not really too concerned whether it was a 6 out of 10 game or a 10 out of 10 game. So now for some slightly closer analysis. First of all, the concept of the phantom pain is shot through the whole game, like the shrapnel that's shot through the body of Big Boss. Let's take a look at these foreign bodies, these elements that just don't quite feel like they belong in a blockbuster Metal Gear Solid game. First of all, we have a protagonist that is essentially mute. Now, much consternation was made over the decision to replace David Hayter with Kiefer Sutherland, but in the final game, Kiefer is oddly absent. It's partially to do with his more restrained, nuanced delivery, but there are many instances where it feels like there should be some witty dialogue from Snake, some back and forth.
Okay, have time to go. What happened to the woman? The woman? We gave her a light. She took the short way down.
In 5, he just appears to be the missing half of a conversation. Next, we have the abandonment of series staples such as the experimental inventory item uses and the gimmicky boss fights. Whilst MGS5 is no stranger to the amusing and considered outcomes of bizarre overlaps of disparate items and systems, which is something that the series has always featured, there are definitely fewer instances of pure novelty in 5. It's possible to chalk up some of it to streamlining or reinvention, but it's still interesting to observe the thinning of Boss's inventory from 3 and Peace Walker into V. More importantly, the memorable boss fights of the series' history are now incredibly sparse. The Skull Squad and the Man on Fire do honour tradition, but they don't come close to the personality and invention of Foxhound, the Cobra Unit, or even Dead Cell. Finally, we have the removal of the lengthy cutscene and codec support for the story. Delivery of exposition in MGS5 is predominantly restrained to terse, tautly edited cutscenes, or punchy monologues in various tapes that can be listened to as and when the player wishes to. Now, whilst this is a fitting method for an open world game, it also feels like a reaction to criticisms of the previous game's methods of story delivery. Satisfaction with either approach is always going to be mostly subjective, but to go from such heavy-handed forced exposition to something far more elective, narrative push to the fringes of the core experience, well, that's either an impressive about-face of prior intent or a considered thematic choice. These differences from past games can easily be chalked up to iteration or reinvention, or, as previously stated, as a response to critical complaints. But perhaps they are authored decisions deployed to subvert or direct player expectations. After all, over the course of its 28-year-long series, the story of Big Boss seems to see the character shift sharply from a plucky young protege into a tyrannical military mastermind. It's because of this that Kojima's initial promise of a chapter to bridge the gap from Peace Walker to Metal Gear seems to be a deliberate choice to invoke a sense of dissatisfaction in players who miss the point where Big Boss begins his downfall. It's an arc that has its roots in his decision to build a private military force that answered to no nation and no government. In 5, the farcical catch-all conclusions of 4 are abandoned for a far more elusive story, one open to player interpretation and investigation, which creates a decidedly more mature atmosphere. And, with this, how did we get to here from there is a question that players are asking themselves after kidnapping hundreds of soldiers into their employ, forcing them to work for Venom's PMC, and sending them on mercenary missions whilst arming them with enough weapons to make them a worry for any small, resource-rich country. This is something that other commentators have elucidated on perfectly well. Big Boss is already a villain, someone willing to disappear and sacrifice the world, sell out his own friends to create an illusion, and it's all just to further his own monomaniacal pursuit of what he believes to be the boss's legacy. These are all great narrative ideas, but in 5 they hide in shadows and spectres, refusing to flesh themselves out into something more corporeal. This is why I think Kojima ultimately presents us with a narrative of absence, a text that actively courts player dissatisfaction via its story beats and system choices. To try and pull this off in any medium is incredibly ambitious at best, and awfully risky at worst. But Kojima isn't the first to try this, and he certainly won't be the last. There are many texts that feature similar ideas, but the game itself explicitly references one in particular, which is Herman Melville's Moby Dick. If you've not read it yet, and I don't blame you for having not gotten around to it yet due to its fairly intimidating size, it's a sprawling novel, at once an encyclopedic explanation of the sea, the act of whaling, the life of a sailor, but it's also about the biology and habitats of whales, as well as an observation of the dark path of revenge, and how a singular obsession with it can consume people and those around them. It's obviously a very pertinent theme to Metal Gear Solid 5, and although the Ishmael and the Ahabs all seem to be pointed at Big Boss, it's worth noting that Kaz seems to be the person who is most consumed by revenge. Still, in the book, the spectre of Moby Dick haunts Ahab, and over the course of the novel, it escapes him at every turn. The final encounter with the Leviathan is unexpectedly abrupt and anticlimactic. In 3 short chapters, the whale has been found, fought, and it's ended Ahab's journey in a cruel and curt encounter. Beyond Moby Dick, MGS5 also reminded me of David Foster Wallace's vast, magnificent postmodern comedy, Infinite Jest. It features a narrative that's constructed to feel like a circular narrative. He calls it annular. It starts in the present moment, and then it spends the entire novel in a flashback, which feels as though it's building to a logical conclusion which will explain exactly why our protagonist finds himself screaming on the floor of a dean's office, despite his deep internal composure. Crucially, in Infinite Jest, the chunk of the story that bridges the end and the beginning is missing, and it's purposeful, because to fill that gap is no more interesting than to leave it blank. Supposition and suggestion litter the novel, and only the most attentive and studious of readers will be able to trace the elements that explain exactly what happens in that absence. Yet, like Moby Dick, it cannot help but feel partially unsatisfactory. Although, in both cases, this is a deliberate choice, and most importantly a choice that is supported and reinforced by other elements of the story. The Phantom Pain is also littered with nods and winks at its grand reveal, from the use of the man who sold the world, to the speech and attitude of Ishmael in the opening scenes. Adding further evidence to this is the fact that Eli, who is quite obviously liquid, fails a genetics test. Earlier, the mammal pod from Peace Walker doesn't recognise you, and there's also the retconning of the helicopter explosion at the end of Ground Zeroes, which you can see if you follow the optional mission path which lets you find Paz. For those who don't know, it puts a heavy focus on showing the 2 people in the helicopter, and that's a reversal of what we see in Ground Zeroes. It could be argued that these hints don't quite build toward a satisfying conclusion, and that might well be because of the absence of any real weight to Chapter 2. However, I can't quite help but feel like it's all deliberate. Another element that can be argued to be missing from the Phantom Pain is that feeling of it being heavily authored by Kojima. His narrative stylistics often feel restrained in 5. The trace elements echo throughout the game, incahate and vestigial. We have Sahelanthropus, a ludicrous creation that could only exist within a Metal Gear game. Towering mech that hoots and hollers like a child that doesn't know its own strength as it attempts to crush Venom. And that then turns out to be incredibly pertinent, as it's being powered by the young Psychomantis, a character who feeds on the rage of an inarticulate and petulant young child soldier who feels locked into the legacy of his father. If we add to the mix the charred remains of Volgin, a man who just simply refuses to die, at times this game feels like Kojima at his most absurd, and at others it feels like a standard open world, albeit one with incredibly refined mechanics and systems. It's through the inclusion of these elements, these highly focused and uniquely Metal Gear particles that feel abandoned and adrift in an episodic open world game, that the feeling of the Phantom Pain manifests itself. The series' hallmarks were there, and we can feel them moving under the skin, as we enter commands to dodge a teleporting parasitic soldier, or Fulton a goat into the sky to our own private zoo. By the time the curtain closes, it feels like that limb that we were controlling isn't there. The muscular metatextual arm of the storywriting team that had plunged into the surreal and the absurd to pull out the poignant and the pertinent is missing. It's a spectre that sends us phantom sensations. And that's why this could well be Kojima at his most devilish. In an attempt to convey this feeling, the very absence of what his games are known for is invoked. The deliberate attempt to remove Metal Gear from 5 has instead caused it to grasp at ideas on a par with Metal Gear Solid 2. It's aware of itself as a text. To delineate where Konami's meddling and Kojima's editing begin and end is fairly fruitless, and it'll likely remain shrouded in mystery for years to come. But it's also not particularly useful. Straying into objective accounts and value judgments on the game doesn't really tell us anything. How can we accurately articulate our feelings on a text that attempts to elude us? A text that actively pushes back at those who attempt to unpack it by creating a sense of disappointment. The attempt to craft a story that's entirely rooted in the realms of dissatisfaction, shrouded in phantoms, permitted truths, and absences, is absolutely Kojima's most mature narrative work to date. Cut content and trailers that promise more than was delivered can even be seen as an extension of the philosophy of absence. After he gave players all the answers in Metal Gear Solid 4 and was perceived as failing to deliver, well, it's a start in the evolution then to create a game that explains that answers don't always need to be there, that reading between the lines and understanding that stories don't always have to satisfy you is far more affecting than the contrived catharsis that became the downfall of Solid Snake's finale. Unpicking the whys and the wherefores of the Phantom Pain will never lead anyone to an absolute and unqualified truth. And it's in this that Kojima hits on something exemplary. Allowing the player to forge Boss's legacy, to inhabit the body of an illusion crafted to realise someone's single-minded vision, is both a thank you to the player for nearly 3 decades of support and also the ultimate betrayal. Kojima covertly turns the player into the villain they so desperately wanted to see follow a traditional descent into a cold and bitter revenge. To give a player over 100 hours of content in a market where fulfillment and satisfaction of their desires is the number one goal is a simple task, or at least it's the task that most games seem to ascribe to. But Metal Gear Solid 5 seems to do so with a deliberate aim of invoking an absence, of actively trying to rob the player of the ultimate achievement of pointing out that cliché moment when their favourite hero becomes a cackling villain. And I feel like that singular drive to disappoint the player is the true achievement, the true phantom pain.